Till Death Do Us Part is a promise for the future. For these 6 couples, the clock stopped almost immediately. One moment they were celebrating, the next they were victims of physics. We analyzed the specific mechanical failures, from cheap fuel tanks to faulty bridges, that erased their futures instantly. Warning: these stories are true. Please don't repeat the mistakes of others. On February 10, 2018, the Arizona sky was a piercing, deceptive blue, offering perfect visibility for what was supposed to be the highlight of a dream vacation for Jonathan Udall, age 31, and his new wife, Ellie Mylud, age 29. The British couple was in the prime of their lives, celebrating their recent marriage and Jonathan's birthday with a group of close friends, checking off a bucket list experience that millions of people dream of: a sunset helicopter tour over the most famous gorge on Earth. They were not thrill seekers looking for danger. They were sensible consumers who trusted the system, booking their flight with Papillon Grand Canyon Helicopters, a company that operated thousands of flights and held a reputation for professionalism. They boarded an Airbus EC-130B4, a sleek and modern aircraft that gleamed in the desert sun, looking like the pinnacle of aviation technology. As they strapped into their seats, the couple felt the rush of excitement, completely unaware that they were sitting directly on top of a grandfathered engineering defect, a lethal flaw that was perfectly legal on paper, but catastrophic in the real world. The flight began smoothly, the machine dancing over the Colorado River. But as the pilot approached the landing pad at Quartermaster Canyon, the invisible physics of the canyon took over. The aircraft encountered a sudden, violent tailwind condition, a chaotic current of air that rendered the tail rotor ineffective. The helicopter entered a spin, a terrifying loss of aerodynamic control that turned the scenic view into a sickening blur of rotating rock and sky. The pilot fought the controls, but gravity won, and the machine dropped out of the air, slamming onto the rocky canyon floor. This is the moment where the story shifts from a terrifying accident to a preventable tragedy. The impact itself was heavy and violent, yes, but it was survivable. The cabin structure held its shape. The G-forces were within the limits of human tolerance. In a parallel universe, where safety was prioritized over profit, Jonathan and Ellie would have walked away with broken bones, bruises, and a terrifying story to tell their future children. But they never got that chance because of what happened inside the fuselage immediately after the skid hit the ground. The helicopter was equipped with a standard, rigid plastic fuel tank, a design that was known to be vulnerable to shattering upon hard impact. The manufacturer had long since developed a safer, crash-resistant fuel system, a flexible bladder that acts like a heavy-duty rubber balloon to contain the fuel during a crash, stretching instead of breaking. But because of a regulatory loophole, the operator was not legally required to retrofit older helicopter models with this life-saving technology. It was a cold calculation of cost versus risk, and on that February afternoon, the math turned against the newlyweds. Upon impact, the rigid tank cracked open like an eggshell. Gallons of highly flammable Jet A fuel poured out, instantly coating the wreckage and the ground. Within seconds, a spark, likely from severed wiring or hot metal scraping against stone, ignited the vapor. The survivable accident instantly transformed into a thermal trap. Jonathan and Ellie were conscious. They were alive, but they were pinned in their seats by the wreckage, surrounded by a rapidly expanding wall of fire. The tragedy here is not the crash, but the horrifying realization of entrapment. They were seated in a position that made immediate escape impossible as the flames consumed the oxygen and the structure around them. The fire did not give them time to struggle. It moved with the speed of a chemical reaction, turning the cabin into a furnace before rescue could even be attempted by the bystanders who ran toward the smoke. The scene was chaotic, but the outcome was dictated by simple chemistry and thermodynamics. Jonathan and Ellie were eventually pulled from the wreckage, still alive but suffering from catastrophic thermal injuries that compromised their bodies beyond the point of recovery. They fought for their lives in a hospital for several weeks, holding on through sheer will, but the damage to their biological systems was total. They passed away days apart, their honeymoon ending not with the sunset, but with the slow, beeped rhythm of life support machines fading into silence. The subsequent investigation exposed the brutal truth that haunts this case. A simple rubber bladder, costing a fraction of the helicopter's price, would have prevented the fire entirely. The fuel would have stayed contained, the helicopter would have been just a broken piece of metal, and the passengers would have been survivors. Their deaths forced a massive shift in the aviation industry, leading to new laws requiring crash-resistant fuel systems in all helicopters and closing the loophole that killed them. Jonathan and Ellie Udall did not die because of a fall from the sky. They died because a corporation decided that upgrading a fuel tank was an unnecessary expense, proving that in the calculus of modern tourism, safety is sometimes treated as a luxury option until a tragedy forces it to become a requirement. The ancient dream of flight is often romanticized as a peaceful drift among the clouds, a silent escape from the noise of the world below. But in reality, a hot air balloon is a primitive vessel, a wicker basket hanging from a bag of gas, entirely at the mercy of the wind and the judgment of a single man. On the morning of July 30th, 2016, in the open fields near Lockhart, Texas, the air was heavy, with a creeping, low-lying mist that should have been a warning sign to stay on the ground. Matt and Sunday Rowan, a vibrant couple who had been married for just 6 months, were there to celebrate, treating this flight as a continuation of their honeymoon phase, a romantic adventure to mark the start of their life together. They were happy, snapping photos of the glowing burner flame and the receding earth, posting them to social media with captions that spoke of joy and excitement. They looked at their pilot, Alfred "Skip" Nichols, and saw a seasoned aviator, a man in charge. They trusted him implicitly, handing over their safety to his expertise. They had no way of knowing the invisible variables that were already sealing their fate. The pilot was not the reliable captain they imagined. His system was awash with a cocktail of prescription medications, including Valium and oxycodone, substances that dull reaction times and cloud judgment. Moreover, the weather was not cooperating. As the balloon drifted higher, it entered a thick layer of clouds, turning the world into a milk bottle, a pilot's term for a complete whiteout where up, down, and forward lose their meaning. In this sensory deprivation tank, the pilot made the fatal decision to descend, searching for a gap in the clouds to spot the ground. He was gambling with altitude, dropping a blind object through a white veil, unaware of what was waiting for him in the gray void below. The balloon broke through the bottom of the cloud layer, but it was too late to correct the trajectory. They were not drifting over an empty field. They were descending directly onto the backbone of the Texas power grid. Looming out of the mist were massive metal towers carrying high-voltage transmission lines, humming with 345,000 volts of electricity, power sufficient to feed a city. This is the moment where the romantic dream of flight collided with the brutal reality of industrial physics. The pilot attempted a desperate maneuver to burn hard and rise, but the laws of momentum are unforgiving to a heavy craft. The lower part of the balloon's envelope and the basket cables made contact with the wires. It was not a collision in the traditional sense. It was an electrical event of catastrophic magnitude. When 345,000 volts bridge a gap, they do not just shock. They create an electrical arc hotter than the surface of the sun. The air itself turned into plasma. The sound was not a crash, but a deafening, thunderous crack that shook the ground for miles. The electrical current surged through the metal cables suspending the basket, instantly melting them. In a fraction of a second, the basket was severed from the balloon envelope. The colorful fabric of the balloon freed from its weight, shot upward into the sky, while the basket, now a burning cage containing Matt, Sunday, and 14 others, fell nearly 100 feet to the pasture below. The tragedy is that the passengers likely had no time to process the transition from a peaceful morning flight to a terminal disaster. The electrical arc and the subsequent fall happened faster than the human brain can maximize a fear response. The fire that followed on the ground was intense, fed by the propane tanks used for the burner, erasing any chance of survival or rescue. Matt and Sunday Rowan, who had just begun to build their shared future, were gone before the smoke even cleared. The investigation revealed that the pilot had received weather warnings, but chose to launch anyway, a decision compounded by his impaired medical state. The passengers paid the ultimate price for the illusion of competence. They believed that because a service was sold, it was safe. They believed that the man at the controls was a guardian, not a liability. This story stands as a terrifying reminder of the fragility of the human body when suspended in a primitive craft amidst the high-energy infrastructure of the modern world. One moment, they were floating in silence, holding hands. The next, they were simply gone, victims of a blind descent into a voltage that biology was never meant to withstand. The Alpine Mountains at night possess a duality that is both enchanting and terrifying. Under the moonlight, the snow-covered peaks look like a soft white blanket designed for romance, but in reality, they are a frozen fortress of rock and ice where the temperature drops to levels that turn water into stone and where gravity waits for a single mistake. In January 2014, the Cermis Massif in the Trentino region of Italy was the picturesque backdrop for the honeymoon of Michela and Alessandro, a young Italian couple who had come to the mountains to celebrate the beginning of their shared life. They were seeking the kind of magic that tourism brochures promise, a pristine winter wonderland, far from the noise of the city, where the silence is absolute and the air is pure. On their final night, they decided to partake in a popular but deceptive activity, a nighttime snowmobile excursion. To the untrained eye, a snowmobile appears to be a recreational toy, a jet ski on snow that is easy to handle and fun to ride. This is a fatal misconception. A modern snowmobile is a heavy industrial machine, weighing over 500 pounds, powered by an engine capable of immense torque, and it requires significant physical strength and shifting of body weight to steer, especially on uneven terrain. Alessandro took the controls, with Michela holding onto him from behind, trusting his guidance and the stability of the machine. They set off into the darkness, the headlight of the snowmobile cutting a narrow tunnel of visibility through the vast pitch-black void of the forest. For a while, the ride was everything they imagined. The rush of cold air, the roar of the engine, and the thrill of speed. But the mountain has a treacherous geography that is hidden by the night. As they navigated the trail, the visual cues that humans rely on for orientation, depth perception, horizon lines, and peripheral vision were erased by the darkness. The fatal factor here was the snow itself. During the day, the sun softens the surface, making it forgiving. But at night, the temperature plummets, and the snowpack refreezes into a substance that is physically closer to concrete than to powder. Alessandro, likely disoriented by the lack of visual reference points or misjudging a turn in the deceptive light, steered the machine slightly off the groomed path. It was a matter of inches, but on a mountain, inches determined survival. The snowmobile's ski caught an edge or dipped into a depression, and the center of gravity shifted past the point of no return. The heavy machine did not just slide, it rolled. This is the moment where the romantic excursion ended and the laws of physics took over with brutal indifference. The couple was ejected from the seat, but they were on a steep, icy slope with a gradient that made stopping impossible. They were no longer tourists. They were falling objects accelerating due to gravity. The tragedy was compounded by the terrain. They were not tumbling into soft drifts. They were sliding at high velocity down a chute of ice, punctuated by jagged rocks and dense pine trees that acted as immovable barriers. The impact was not a cushion. It was a collision with a solid, unyielding force. The mechanics of the trauma were severe and instantaneous. The human body, fragile and unprotected against such kinetic energy, struck the natural obstacles of the ravine with a force that caused catastrophic injuries incompatible with life. The silence that followed the crash was heavier than the roar of the engine had ever been. There were no witnesses in the isolated darkness, no immediate sirens, only the cold wind hissing through the trees. Rescue teams were eventually alerted when the couple failed to return, but the mountain does not give up its victims easily. When the responders finally located the wreckage at the bottom of the ravine, the scene was one of stillness. Michaela and Alessandro had been thrown from the vehicle, their bodies coming to rest on the frozen ground, the cold preserving the final tragedy of their honeymoon. They had died not because they were reckless daredevils, but because they underestimated the environment. Their story remains a chilling reminder that the line between a winter fairy tale and a forensic scene is often just one wrong turn in the dark. The ocean is a hostile environment that tolerates human presence only as long as our technology holds and our nerves remain calm. But the moment panic sets in, the water becomes a suffocating weight that erases life with terrifying silence. On October 22, 2003, Tina Watson, a 26-year-old from Alabama, was living the dream that millions of brides fantasize about. She was on her honeymoon with her new husband, Gabe Watson, in Queensland, Australia, preparing to dive the Great Barrier Reef, one of the natural wonders of the world. They were aboard the dive vessel Spoilsport, surrounded by the endless blue of the Pacific, ready to explore the historic wreck of the SS Yongala. To the casual observer, they looked like the perfect couple embarking on an adventure, but beneath the surface, the variables for disaster were already aligning. Tina was not an experienced diver. She had only recently earned her certification, a piece of plastic that legally allowed her to dive but did not inoculate her against the primal fear of the deep. Gabe, on the other hand, was a certified rescue diver, a title that implies a high level of competence and a specific duty to protect one's buddy. The dangerous assumption here was that a certification card equals capability in a crisis. As they descended into the water, the current was strong, a powerful invisible river moving through the ocean that can disorient even seasoned swimmers. They reached a depth of about 50 feet, 15 meters, a zone where the pressure is heavy and the surface looks like a distant shimmering roof. At this critical depth, something went wrong. According to witness accounts and later investigations, Tina began to struggle against the current. Whether it was a mask flood, a buoyancy control issue, or simply the overwhelming physiological response, panic seized her. Panic underwater is a lethal feedback loop. The heart races, the breathing becomes rapid and shallow, and the logic centers of the brain shut down. She reached out to her husband, her lifeline in this blue void. This is the moment where the story diverges into a chilling mystery of human behavior. In a standard rescue scenario, the partner's absolute duty is to stabilize, share air, or execute a controlled ascent together. Instead, in the chaos of the current, Gabe and Tina separated. He would later claim that her panic knocked his mask askew, and that the current was too strong to fight, forcing him to drift away to the surface. What followed was a scene of horrifying slow-motion tragedy captured on the periphery of another diver's camera. While Gabe ascended to the surface alone, Tina did not. She did not thrash or fight. She simply sank. Overcome by unconsciousness or hypoxic blackout, she drifted downward, a silent figure in a wetsuit falling toward the seafloor. She came to rest on the sandy bottom, face up, her regulator out of her mouth. staring blankly at the surface she would never reach again. It was a picture of absolute loneliness. Other divers nearby, realizing something was wrong, swam to her aid, but the minutes that had passed were fatal. They brought her to the surface, and the crew of the Spoilsport fought desperately to revive her, performing CPR on the deck of the ship while her husband watched. But the physiology of drowning is unforgiving. The brain, starved of oxygen, had suffered irreversible damage. Tina was pronounced dead, her honeymoon ending in a body bag on the deck of a boat in paradise. The aftermath was a storm of legal battles and accusations, with Gabe Watson pleading guilty to manslaughter for failing to fulfill his duty as a rescue buddy, serving a short sentence in Australia. But beyond the courtroom drama, the death of Tina Watson stands as a brutal lesson in the fragility of trust underwater. It exposes the terrifying reality that when you strap on a tank and descend into the deep, your life is often in the hands of the person swimming next to you. If that person panics, fails, or makes a selfish choice, the ocean will claim you without hesitation. Tina died because she trusted that her partner and her training would save her, unaware that in the silent, crushing pressure of the deep, you are ultimately alone. The seduction of flight is powerful because it offers a perspective usually reserved for birds, a feeling of total, weightless freedom high above the mundane world. But in the unregulated corners of the adventure tourism industry, this freedom is often suspended by a single, cheap piece of synthetic rope that has been used one too many times. In July 2010, on the sun-drenched coast of Alibag, India, Ganesh and Sinu were celebrating the beginning of their marriage with the kind of naive optimism that defines a honeymoon. They were young, deeply in love, and caught up in the vibrant energy of the beach, eager to create a memory that would last a lifetime. They decided to try parasailing, a popular activity where a parachute is towed behind a speedboat, lifting the riders into the sky like a kite. To the tourists on the ground, it looks effortless and safe. A gentle glide over the water, but mechanically, it is a high-stress system where the entire weight of the passengers and the immense drag of the parachute are focused on one critical point: the tow rope. Ganesh and Sinu were strapped into the tandem harness, trusting the operators, the boat, and the equipment implicitly. As the boat accelerated, the canopy inflated with a snap, and they were lifted off the sands of Varsoli Beach, rising higher into the air until the people below looked like scattered ants. For a few minutes, it was pure magic. They were floating 300 feet, about 100 meters, in the air holding hands, looking out at the vast Arabian Sea, feeling like they were flying. But the physics of parasailing are unforgiving, and the equipment they were trusting was silently failing. The rope connecting them to the boat was under tremendous tension, fighting the lift of the parachute and the drag of the wind. Unknown to the couple, this specific rope was likely worn, frayed, or simply not rated for the dynamic load of two adults in gusty conditions. It was a material fatigue time bomb waiting for a spike in pressure. Suddenly, without warning, the rope snapped. The sound was like a whip crack, but the result was a terrifying silence as the engine noise faded away. Instantly, the connection to the boat, their only source of control and propulsion, was gone. In a properly designed system, a parachute might drift down gently, but the wind on that day was strong and capricious. Without the tension from the boat to keep the canopy inflated and directional, the physics changed. Instead of a gentle descent, the parachute became a slave to the air currents. It did not glide. It drifted uncontrollably, swinging the couple wildly in the sky. The tragedy unfolded in full view of the horrified crowd on the beach, a slow-motion nightmare where gravity began to win the battle against aerodynamics. The wind pushed them away from the safety of the deep water and back toward the hard-packed sand of the shore. Then, the canopy collapsed or stalled, and the couple plummeted from the sky. The impact was brutal and clinically decisive. They hit the surface with the velocity of a fall from a 10-story building. Sinu, the young bride, bore the brunt of the catastrophe. Whether she struck the shallow surf or the hard sand, the trauma was consistent with a high-velocity deceleration. She suffered catastrophic impact injuries that left no chance of survival. Ganesh also fell, sustaining severe injuries, but he remained conscious enough to witness the horror unfolding next to him. The chaos on the beach was absolute. Bystanders and operators rushed to help, dragging the tangled parachute and the broken bodies from the surf. But the damage had been done in the split second of impact. Sinu was rushed to a local hospital, but she was pronounced dead on arrival, her life ending just days after it had officially begun. Ganesh survived, but he was left to navigate the rest of his life with the physical scars of the fall and the psychological torture of watching his wife die in an activity that was sold to them as 5 minutes of fun. The investigation into the accident revealed the dark underbelly of adventure tourism, a lack of safety standards, poor equipment maintenance, and ropes that are used until they fail. Ganesh and Sinu did not die because they took a foolish risk. They died because a piece of nylon rope, costing perhaps a few dollars, was pushed beyond its limit, proving that in the equation of budget tourism, the value of a human life is sometimes calculated as less than the cost of a replacement cable. The most dangerous aspect of nature is not its anger, but its speed. We assume that if a disaster comes, we will have time to react, to pack a bag, and to drive away. But when the atmosphere turns against you, the concept of time evaporates instantly. On July 23, 2018, the coastal resort town of Mati, Greece, looked like the definition of a Mediterranean paradise, a place where pine forests met the blue Aegean Sea and the air smelled of resin and salt. Brian O'Callaghan Westrop and his wife Zoe Holohan, a couple from Ireland, had chosen this specific location for their honeymoon, seeking a quiet week to celebrate their new union. They were in the absolute prime of their happiness, relaxed and tanned, completely unaware that the geography of the town, narrow winding streets surrounded by dense, dry vegetation, was essentially a dormant trap waiting for a spark. That spark arrived in the form of a wildfire starting in the mountains. But this was not a normal fire. It was driven by gale-force winds reaching 75 miles per hour, creating a phenomenon known as a firestorm. In this state, fire behaves less like a chemical reaction and more like a flash flood, flowing over the land faster than a human can run, devouring oxygen and spitting out burning embers that ignite new fronts hundreds of yards ahead. When the smoke first appeared, it seemed distant, a problem for someone else, but the wind compressed the timeline of the disaster. Within minutes, the sky turned a bruised apocalyptic orange, and the heat became physical, a heavy blanket pressing down on the resort. Brian and Zoe did what logic and instinct dictated. They grabbed their essential belongings and got into a vehicle to evacuate. This was the moment the trap sprang shut. The infrastructure of Mati was not built for a mass exodus. The narrow roads instantly clogged with panic, turning into a gridlock of cars that were no longer vehicles but metal cages waiting for the flames. Realizing that the car was a coffin, the couple made the split-second decision to abandon it and run for the only safe place left, the sea. They joined a chaotic stream of tourists and locals fleeing toward the water, running through a landscape that was rapidly disintegrating. The smoke was now a solid wall, stinging the eyes and choking the lungs, reducing visibility to almost zero. The heat was so intense it felt like a physical blow, radiating from burning pines that exploded like bombs due to the sap boiling inside them. In this sensory hell, the most tragic moment of their lives occurred. Brian and Zoe were holding hands, tethered together by fear and love, navigating the burning debris. But amidst the stampede of terrified people and the blinding smoke, their grip was broken. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was a consequence of pure chaos, a stumble, a push from the crowd, a moment of disorientation in the dark smoke. One moment, Zoe felt her husband's hand. The next, she was grasping at empty, superheated air. She screamed his name, but the roar of the wind and the fire swallowed her voice. Forced forward by the crushing crowd and the searing heat, Zoe made it to the water's edge, suffering from painful burns, and found refuge in a sea cave, huddled with others as the town burned above them. She survived the night, clinging to the desperate hope that Brian was just a few yards away, perhaps on another part of the beach. But the fire had moved faster than him. Brian had become disoriented in the thick, toxic smoke, separated from the path to safety by a wall of flames. His body was found later, tragically close to the water that would have saved him. He passed away before the flames reached him. Rather, he had likely succumbed to the thermal intensity and the toxic gases, his system overwhelmed by the extreme environment before the flames even reached him. The aftermath of this event is heartbreaking. Zoe emerged from the hospital weeks later, a widow before she had even finished her honeymoon, carrying the physical scars of the fire and the psychological weight of that split second when their hands parted. The Mahdi fire killed 104 people that day, proving that when nature decides to reclaim the land, our modern confidence in safety, rescue, and tomorrow is stripped away, leaving us with nothing but the primitive, brutal struggle to breathe. We call these accidents, Bertupane, but in reality, they are crimes of negligence. If you value the truth, subscribe now. Here is the question for the comments. If you were in that burning helicopter or drifting parachute, would you spend your final seconds trying to save your partner, knowing it might kill you both? Or would instinct take over to save yourself? Be honest. Most people lie about this,